Thank you very much for the invitation. And I just start. So I'm going to talk today about my dissertation, Emotions in Political Learning. And when we talk about emotions in politics, I guess we can all think about several situations where emotions are tightly connected. For example, when you see protesters on the street being angry about a specific policy issue, or when you think about seeing our party or supported party win an election and the enthusiasm connected to it. But when we talk about learning, it's another question whether emotions are involved in these situations. And before digging into the research on the topic, I would like to start or read two quotes to you. One from a student and one from a teacher. So this is a quote from a social studies teacher saying, "To me, when kids bring in their emotions into what they are learning, it affects the learning community in a very positive way, because it sends a signal to the kids that, oh wait, this is something that someone feels strongly about, and maybe I should pay attention." And from a student, "I'm very interested in politics, but the lessons are designed to be deadly boring, and that is a great pity." So here we can see that emotions are definitely part of the learning process. And what I am talking about in my dissertation is mainly how are emotions, which I experience in the situations related to political learning, and when are emotions experienced, and what are the associations to outcomes of civic education. I will first talk about the theory, control value theory, and academic emotions, about research from political psychology, and also research on civic education specifically, and then shortly summarize my 3 dissertation papers. I will finalize with the discussion and applications and the theory and practice. If there are any questions in between, feel free to interrupt and to just forward your question, and I'm happy if we could have some discussion in the end as well. So let's start. So when we think about emotions, one important step is first to define and make explicit what we mean when we talk about emotions. So emotions are often described as a multi-component prototypical pattern of experience, and those prototypical patterns are given specific names, for example, anger, or enthusiasm, enjoyment, boredom, and that's what we call discrete emotions. In the academic context, so when learning, there are 4 different types of emotion differentiated, and they can be differentiated by the object focus, meaning those specific aspects where the emotions focus on. And quite a lot of research is looking at achievement emotions, so emotions experienced in achievement settings, either directly during a learning activity, or retrospective, or in advance of a test, for example. For example, the pride when getting a grade, or having achieved something, or hope to get a good grade, or also just enjoyment during learning. And then epistemic emotions, which are emotions focused at information processing, often triggered by incongruity of information, one's prior beliefs. Then topic emotions, which are emotions associated with a specific topic, and social emotions. And the first 2 emotions are those emotions which are said to be directly pertain to learning. And if we now want to know how these emotions are related to learning, and Peckhorn, in his control value theory, often or borrows from the SIRC-complex model, which differentiates discrete emotions along 2 dimensions, which are activation and valence. So we can differentiate emotions by how they are experienced, whether they are experienced as positive or negative, which is the valence component, and also whether they are experienced as activating, so with high arousal, or less activating. And from this SIRC-complex model, which is then part of the cognitive motivational model, it is said that especially positive activating emotions are positively related to learning, while negative deactivating emotions like boredom are negatively related to learning. And that for emotions like positive and deactivating and negative activating, it's more complex, and there is no uniform pattern, or it's also variable depending on what we look at. So here you can see an adaptation of the control value theory, and it does not only explain now how emotions are related to learning, but also when emotions are experienced, and there differentiates between proximal antecedents, which are then control and value experiencing, that then, for example, one is in control of fields, in control of a situation, and values it highly to be, for example, successful in this learning task, then, for example, enjoyment is likely to be experienced. And on the other hand, more distal antecedents, which also relate to these proximal antecedents of emotions. For example, teaching methods, individual dispositions, or the family socialization. And now, when we talk about specifically political learning, we know that for the control value theory and for those associations between antecedents and effects of emotions, there's already a lot of support from various domains, for example, from mathematics, from language learning. But for political learning, there's less research on the topic. And it might be also more complex in this specific context, because civic education is characterized by by a lot of diverse formats. So it's not always as a single subject, but often also as a cross-curricular subject, often combined with different subjects, or in the participation at school at all. Then it has multiple outcomes, for example, not only a knowledge acquisition, but also motivation to engage in politics, the value development, identity development. It's often including very recent and competitive issues, current issues, which are very societally contested, and thus also often identity-related topics, because those are often issues which are tightly or very close to identities like race-specific aspects, or current topics which are discussed in society. There is some in literature and research looking at emotions in civic education, but mainly from a philosophical and qualitative perspective, and less systematic analysis of discrete emotions. There's one study from Byram Edstemir looking at general feelings about politics, and finding that engaged teaching relates to this general feelings, and the general feelings mediate then associations to students' initiation of political discussions in class. From now, not the context of civic education, but from adult citizens, in political psychology, it's often investigated who gets informed in, for example, during election periods, and looking at the role of emotions in these contexts. And from this literature, we already know that, for example, anxiety, enthusiasm, and anger are often investigated, and also that specifically anxiety is said to relate to who puts attention to political matters and who gets informed about politics. Now, the topic of my dissertation is how are discrete emotions related to political learning, and what are their antecedents and effects in the context of civic education. And we can differentiate between two aims of this dissertation. The first one was to review and synthesize how emotions experienced in politics relate to learning, and then second, to investigate antecedents and effects of discrete emotions, specifically in the context of civic education. Why is this relevant? So first, as I say, there's already a lot of research on the control value theory, but it was rarely investigated in social sciences and new contexts. So specifically in this cross-curricular context, in a more informal learning context, and that also from the literature then on emotions and learning, we don't have a lot of information about learning among adolescents and learning in school. So here the dissertation tries to add some new information. But it also has implications and it's of relevance for practice. So on the one hand, for teachers who are teaching civic education, to know more about how emotions relate to learning, and also to understand why they are experienced. And as a first step, it's also relevant for democracy, because in order to participate informed in politics, of course, citizens need to be informed and learn about those issues, and knowing what the role emotions play in this process is consequently also relevant for the functioning of democracy. So I'm now coming to the 3 dissertation papers, starting with the first paper, which looks at the associations between emotions and learning using a systematic review and meta-analysis. The research question here was which discrete emotions have been analyzed in in political psychology research, and how do they relate to learning. And I conducted a systematic search on various databases, conference proceedings, author consultation, and included studies which analyzed discrete emotions focusing on politics. So here defining it also with the object focus, and an association to learning. And with learning, I try to take a broad perspective on learning and include attention, political attention, information seeking, discussions, and political knowledge. We then used multi-level random effects models in order to synthesize this research and these associations between emotions and learning. Here, what's most important is that I define a sample of studies were 66 studies, of which we could use for effect sizes from 36 studies, and altogether it was 259 effect sizes included. What we can see here in this graph is that the emotions which were investigated varied quite a lot. So we can see that anxiety, anger, and enthusiasm were mainly investigated, and that most of the studies were based in the US and focusing on adults and university college students. So most of the time also not in the context of civic education, but more generally how citizens get informed about politics, and which emotions they experience, often also with experimental studies in order to investigate effects of emotions. We also analyzed the associations separately for experimental and cross-sectional designs, and for those broader categories of emotion groups, which result when we distinguish discrete emotions along these 2 dimensions of activation and valence. And we found positive, so small associations between negative activating emotions and learning in both experimental and cross-sectional designs, and positive associations for cross-sectional designs for positive activating emotions. For negative deactivating emotions, we only had really few effect sizes, and even less for positive deactivating emotions. So what we can take from the study is that overall, the studies were quite heterogeneous in research designs and also in the reporting standards, which limited our possibilities to synthesize the effect sizes, but that there is quite a high homogeneity on investigated emotions and also samples, which draws our attention also now to the missing parts of these studies. But it also shows that specifically activating emotions seem to be relevant, and which partly supports control value theory, but for the negative activating emotions, as I said before, it's more variable. So it seems that in this context, it's either a no or a positive association to learning. But what now about adolescents and learning during civic education at schools? So the second study was asking how are discrete emotions related to political learning, what are their antecedents and outcomes in civic education. So looking at proximal antecedents of control and value appraisals, and then different learning outcomes like motivation, engagement, and knowledge. So the research question was what are antecedents and effects of emotions in the cross-curricular context of civic education. I used an online questionnaire to assess these emotions. On the one hand, achievement emotions focusing on discussions of political social issues in class, and also epistemic emotions focusing on when political information is processed in class. And here it was surprise, curiosity, and confusion, which we included, and where we adapted and developed a new scale in order to assess these emotions. We included various appraisals, for example, internal political efficacy, so how much students feel competent in the context of politics, and also motivation, intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, engagement, and a political knowledge test. We analyzed the data with confirmatory factor analysis and bivariate latent correlations. And I'm now going to summarize the results. So all of those lines are just trying to visualize the bivariate latent correlations. So we found positive associations between control and value appraisals and positive activating emotions, as well as curiosity and surprise. And also positive association for anxiety and anger. Those were investigated as negative activating emotions, but not for shame. And we found negative associations for the negative deactivating emotions to both control and value appraisals and also to confusion. Now looking at the outcomes, we found again positive associations for the positive activating emotions to both motivation and achievement, and exactly the opposite for negative deactivating emotions. While for negative activating emotions, for example, anxiety, anger, shame, it was more variable. Here, for example, we found positive associations to extrinsic motivation, also positive association between anger and engagement, while negative associations, for example, between anxiety and achievement. So the knowledge test. Now looking at the epistemic emotions, again, curiosity and surprise mirrored association also from positive activating emotions, showing positive associations, while confusion mirrored negative deactivating emotions, so showing negative associations to motivation and achievement. The effect sizes vary a bit, but most of them were moderate to big effect sizes, thus showing how important emotions are in their relationships to antecedents and outcomes. So the assumptions of the control value theory in this study was broadly supported, and what is quite interesting is that epistemic emotions are broadly mirrored either positive activating emotions or, in case of confusion, negative deactivating emotions, which was a bit surprising because we would have expected that also confusion would relate positively to learning. But it seems that in this case, when it is assessed as a trait emotion, it shows negative associations. We found quite complex patterns for negative activating emotions. So here it really depended on the antecedent or outcome or also emotion considered. But the study is limited on a specific sample. So it was academic track students, and we did not consider other outcomes of civic education, so only knowledge. But it provides a new scale which can be used in a cross-curricular civic education context, and showed that here, even if it's a bit of a fussy context and not a single subject, emotions can be assessed and reliably used. And yeah, it also shows the relevance of emotions in this context. But as I say, what about more distal antecedents or other outcomes of civic education? And this was the aim of my third study, where we now included also this teaching context as a more distal antecedent. And here the research question was, how is the perceived classroom climate related to emotions and civic learning? And do emotions mediate the association between classroom and learning? Here we used also a similar online questionnaire now in vocational schools, where civic education is taught as a single subject. And we only focused on achievement emotions, namely enjoyment, shame, anxiety, and boredom, and used open classroom climate, which is students' perception on how open and diverse opinions can be discussed in class when talking about political and social issues. And as antecedents for emotions. The outcome here was here not only the knowledge test, but also the intention to participate politically outside of schools of students. And we use the double latent multi-level structural equation model for the analysis. So this in principle looks like this, that we have the student level ratings, and those are then summarized to latent concepts on the student level, but also latent concepts on the classroom level, then displaying the classroom mean. And in the end, then the student latent measure is a deviation from their respective mean in the classroom. I'm now talking you through the results of the study. So we found that the classroom climate positively was associated to enjoyment in both levels and negatively to boredom. So the more open the classroom was experienced, the more enjoyment and the less boredom was experienced, and negatively to anxiety at the student level. When we look at the associations between emotions and outcomes, we again found positive associations between enjoyment and knowledge, while negative associations between shame, anxiety, and boredom and knowledge. We did not find a significant mediation in all of these models. Now, looking at the participation, the associations between classroom climate and emotion are the same, but interestingly, we did now find positive associations between emotions of shame and anxiety and participation, while still a negative associations with boredom, meaning that the more shame and anxiety students experience in class, the more they reported the intent to participate in politics in future. And this again shows these complex and variable effects of these negative activating emotions. Here we also found a significant mediation for enjoyment. So the more open the classroom climate is perceived in a respective classroom by a student, the more enjoyment they experience, and also the more they intend to participate. And a negative mediation for anxiety, which is negative because it's resulting from this negative and this positive term and path in the model. So to summarize, the mediation was only significant in 2 of these models, and we also conducted some robustness checks, including topic emotions, so related generally to politics and frequency of discussions and migration background. And the associations mainly held, but interesting was here that also for topic emotions, anxiety, for example, was related positively to both outcome variables to knowledge and participation by the anxiety experienced in class was negatively related to knowledge. So we can conclude from the study that the classroom climate is an important distal antecedent for enjoyment, anxiety, and boredom, but there's only limited evidence on this mediation and the indirect effect, which we would actually expect from control value theory. So it opens the question whether other distal antecedents could explain these associations better, could be maybe another distal antecedents for emotions and also mediate associations to outcomes. We also found quite big heterogeneity within classes, so students perceive the classroom climate quite differently, and it would be interesting for future study to inspect this heterogeneity. And also the results provide some implications for teaching, showing teachers that when the classroom climate is perceived more openly, when we can manage to have or provide a more open classroom climate, that it also fosters enjoyment and helps that less boredom is experienced. So now summarizing all of these 3 studies is that we found clear patterns for positive activating and negative deactivating emotions throughout the studies. But it gets much more complex when we look at negative activating emotions. So here it really depends whether on the one hand on the object focus of the emotion or the specific discrete emotions on the learning outcome considered. So for example, when we look at the meta-analysis where we found positive associations, we could think that these were mainly emotions related to topic of the topic of politics. And also when we look at the same results then in the third study, comparing topic emotions and the emotion experienced in class, that topic emotions and negative activating emotions related to the topic of politics positively relates to learning, while there also were different associations looking at extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation, engagement versus knowledge. So it seems that the more extrinsic or the more behavioral the outcome is, the more positive these negative activating emotions can be, while for other outcomes, maybe more cognitive outcomes, there are usually more negative associations. Yeah, I'm coming to the limitations. So all of, or specifically the second and third study were cross-sectional study and using data, so it's not possible to have any causal claims about the results. And the evidence is also only from Austria and the specific context of civic education. So it might be interesting to look at it also in other contexts. And this brings me already to the outlook. So extending the research to other teaching characteristics, to other outcomes of civic education would be really important. As I said in the beginning, civic education is not only about knowledge and participation, but also, for example, value development. It would also be interesting to move from trait to state and investigate emotions experienced in a situation and not as a trait, for example, by using experience sampling, and use longitudinal intervention studies in order to identify possible causal mechanisms between emotions and learning. And I didn't talk a lot about social emotions, but this would be also of a big interest, because we can think that politics is often discussed in a social situations. Maybe social emotions are also important aspects in these contexts. Still, I would like to draw also some implications for practice for teachers. And I think what we can say from these results is that teachers don't have to be afraid that it gets too emotional in class when we talk about political social issues, because what we saw in the studies is that especially boredom is most detrimental for learning, and while also negative activating emotions could even help for learning. And this brings me back to the quote from the beginning, which said that the emotions are kind of a signal for other students, that it's now important what they are talking about. And these are not always positive activating emotions, but it seems that for positive activating emotions, this is always the case. But sometimes it could also be that negative activating emotions help put your attention to what is discussed and to be involved in the learning task. So I would like to thank all of my co-authors and also Thomas Getz, my supervisor, and would like to thank you for your attention. And I guess you know how you can contact me, but in case you need it, here again. And yeah, if you have any questions, please let me know. And yeah, thank you for listening.